Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
My protector, the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. The first time I saw him, twilight was settling over our farmhouse like a bruise. I was hanging laundry on the line, a mundane task that had become my anchor in the storm of grief, when something prickled at the base of my neck, that animal instinct we all possess but rarely use anymore. I could sense that someone was watching me. I turned slowly, clothespin still pinched between my fingers, and I scanned the tree line where our property surrendered to the woods. Nothing at first, just the usual shadows stretching between oak trunks and a gentle sway of branches in the October breeze. Then, he moved. What I at first thought was just a shadow detached itself from the darkness between two ancient pines. He stood upright on two legs, but was unmistakably not human. Massive shoulders rolled beneath what appeared to be dark fur, and his head. Oh man, his head was unmistakably canine. A wolf's muzzle, pointed ears, but with an intelligent tilt that sent fear through me. The clothespin slipped from my numb fingers as we locked eyes across the yard. His were amber, catching the day's dying light like twin flames. Not animal eyes, not entirely at least. There was something eerily knowing in them. Something that recognized me? Hello? My voice emerged as a trembling whisper, foolish in the gathering dusk. Who's there? He didn't respond, of course, but he didn't flee either. The creature simply watched me, head slightly canted, massive chest rising and falling with breath that I swore I could almost hear from 50 yards away. Well, I should have been terrified. Any rational woman would have run screaming for the house, for a phone, for a gun. But grief does strange things to fear. When you've already experienced the worst pain imaginable, other terrors can sometimes lose their edge. Besides, something about him felt familiar. It wasn't until my vision blurred that I realized I'd been staring without blinking. I allowed myself that single moment of weakness. One blink, and he was gone. The space between the pines stood empty, with only the disturbed underbrush suggesting that he'd even been there at all. I'm losing my mind, I whispered to myself, pressing cold palms against my feverish cheeks. 4 months without Jim, and now I'm seeing monsters in the woods. Monsters. Was that what I had seen? The rational part of me, the part that still paid bills and showered regularly and nodded appropriately when people said things like, Jim's in a better place now, insisted that I'd glimpsed a bear, maybe, or a particularly large coyote, distorted by fading light and overwhelming grief. But bears don't stand on two legs for that long. Coyotes don't have shoulders that broad or eyes that knew things. I abandoned my laundry half hung and dampening in the evening dew, and I retreated to my empty house. As I locked the door behind me, something I had only started doing after the folded flag was placed in my hands at Arlington, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen hadn't meant me harm. That night I dreamed of Jim's last satellite call before his unit moved into hostile territory. His voice had crackled across thousands of miles. I promise, Ellie, no matter what happens, I'll always be watching over you. In the hazy border between dreaming and waking, those words tangled with amber eyes watching from the tree line. And for the first time since the uniformed officers had appeared at my door, I slept through until morning. Jim and I had met during my final year of veterinary school. He came in with a rescued German shepherd who'd stepped on broken glass. Nothing dramatic, just a Tuesday afternoon appointment that somehow changed everything. While I extracted the glass from Max's paw, Jim told me how he'd found a dog tied to a fence post on base, abandoned by someone who couldn't handle deployment. The way his voice softened when he spoke about this animal he barely knew, told me everything I needed to know about Jim. Our life together unfolded like a dream I'd never dared to imagine for myself. We married on a crisp autumn day, bought the farmhouse with too many acres and not enough bathrooms, and we filled it with rescue animals and weekend projects. Jim's military career meant occasional separations, but we navigated them with the steady compass of two people who simply knew they'd always find their way back to each other. Ellie, he would say, his voice rough with emotion, when we'd reunite after months apart. Coming home to you feels like finally being able to breathe again. I didn't know then how precious those breaths were, or how finite. His final deployment came with a heaviness neither of us acknowledged. The night before he left, we sat on our porch swing watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass like earthbound stars. "I've been having these dreams," Jim whispered, his fingers tracing absent patterns on my palm. "Strange dreams." I leaned into his shoulder and asked him to tell me. "I'm running through forests I've never seen, but somehow know. I'm not entirely myself." He laughed self-consciously and said, "It's nothing, it's pre-deployment jitters." But something in his eyes, something I'd never seen before, made my skin feel weird. "Jim?" He kissed my forehead, dismissing the moment. "Just know that nothing, not distance, not duty, not even death, could keep me from protecting you, Ellie. I'll always find a way back to you." 3 months later, an IED shattered that promise. Or so I thought. The military funeral exists in my memory as disconnected fragments, the weight of the folded flag in my hands, heavier than physics should allow. Max, whining softly beside me, the terrible precision of the rifle salute, sympathetic murmurs from Jim's unit members about heroism and sacrifice. I existed in the aftermath like a ghost in my own life. I fed the animals, I paid the bills, I nodded at concerned neighbors, but the Ellie who had loved and been loved by Jim seemed to have died somewhere in the dust of a country I couldn't even picture clearly. The dreams began about a month after the funeral. Vivid, disorienting dreams of running through our woods on all fours, sensing every rustling leaf, every scurrying creature. Dreams of standing at the edge of our property watching myself hang laundry with hands that weren't hands at all. I dismissed them as grief's strange workings, until the morning I found muddy paw prints too large to belong to any local wildlife, leading from the woods to our bedroom window, and then back again. That same day, I discovered Jim's dog tags missing from my nightstand. Winter settled over our small town with a bitter determination. 3 months after Jim's death, I forced myself to attend a grief support group at the community center, mostly to silence my sister's constant worried calls. The December evening had already surrendered to darkness by the time our session ended, and the light snow was falling as I cut through Jefferson Park on my way to the parking lot. Going through the park after dark was probably unwise, but grief has a way of reordering your fears. What was a mugger compared to the gaping void of life without Jim? As if summoned by my carelessness, a figure stepped out from behind the gazebo, his face shadowed by a hood. The knife in his hand caught the distant streetlight, a slim gleam of menace and the gathering snow. "Purse! Phone! Now!" His voice was jittery, desperate, more frightening somehow than if he'd been coldly professional. I stood frozen, not from fear, but from a strange detachment. I remember thinking, this doesn't even matter. Nothing really matters anymore. "Are you deaf? Give me your damn purse." He stepped closer, knife extended. That's when I heard it. A low growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. Not the sound of any dog I'd ever treated at my practice. This was primordial, a sound that reached into human DNA and triggered ancient alarms. The mugger heard it too. His eyes widened, darting past me toward the darkness beyond the park's lamplight. "What the heck is that?" he whispered. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Something in me already knew. The growl deepened, closer now. The man's face drained of color as he stared at something behind me. something tall enough that his gaze lifted significantly above my head. His knife clattered to the snow-dusted path. When the creature moved, it was with impossible speed for something so large. A blur of darkness surged past me, and suddenly the mugger was pinned against a tree, feet dangling above the ground, face to face with a nightmare made flesh. The dogman held him with one massive clawed hand, jaws slightly parted to reveal gleaming teeth, hot breath visible in the cold air. I should have run. I should have screamed. Instead, I just whispered, "Don't kill him." The creature's ear twitched toward my voice, though his amber gaze remained fixed on the whimpering man. "Please," I added, surprising myself. With a contemptuous motion, the dogman hurled the mugger aside. The man scrambled to his feet, eyes wild with terror, and fled stumbling into the night. Only then did the creature turn to me. Snow gathered on his dark fur as we regarded each other. The face was wolf-like, yet the expressions were unmistakably sentient. Those eyes, they studied me with concern, head tilting in a gesture so achingly familiar that my knees nearly went weak. "Jim?" The name escaped me as a broken whisper. The creature's ears flattened slightly. One massive paw-like hand lifted, hesitant, then dropped back to his side. Without warning, the creature turned and loped away into the darkness, disappearing among the trees at the park's edge. I stood alone in the gently falling snow, the mugger's abandoned knife at my feet, wondering if grief had finally broken my mind completely, or if the world was far stranger, far more wonderful, and far more terrible than I had ever imagined. The human mind is remarkably skilled at self-protection. For days after the park incident, I cycled through explanations, like a desperate gambler at a slot machine. Maybe it was a hallucination fueled by adrenaline. Maybe it was grief psychosis. Maybe it was even a trained attack dog that had coincidentally appeared at the perfect moment. Each theory was more implausible than the last, yet infinitely more acceptable than the truth hovering at the edges of my consciousness. "You look like you've seen a ghost," my sister remarked during her weekly check-in call. If only it were that simple. I couldn't sleep anymore. Every night I jolt awake to phantom sounds outside my window. Breathing, scratching, the soft pad of heavy feet on our porch. By morning I'd convinced myself that I'd dreamed it all, only to find massive paw prints in the frost-covered ground beneath my bedroom window. My veterinary training demanded logic. My heart, though, demanded answers. So I began digging. First came the clinical research, canine physiology, lupine behavior patterns, genetic anomalies. Medical journals offered nothing but dead ends. Then I ventured into darker territories, folklore, cryptozoology, myths spanning cultures, lycanthropy, skinwalkers, spirit animals, the Dogman of Michigan. I created a hidden folder on my laptop labeled J Research. Each night I would add to it, searching for any thread that might connect my rational scientific world to whatever it was that was happening in the shadows of my property. "You should talk to someone," my colleague Susan suggested carefully over coffee, eyeing the dark circles beneath my eyes. "Grief does strange things to people, you know." Perhaps she was right, but the therapist I half-heartedly visited offered nothing but pamphlets on the stages of grief and gentle suggestions about creating closure. Closure wasn't exactly what I needed. Understanding, that was what I needed. It was Jim's army buddy Marcus who unknowingly gave me the first real clue. He had stopped by with a box of Jim's personal effects from his locker on base. He was reading some weird stuff toward the end, Marcus commented, pulling out a worn book on Native American spirit mythology. Said something about preparing for anything. You know how superstitious guys get before deployment. That night I found a passage that Jim had circled. It read, The warrior's spirit can take many forms to protect what he loves. The strongest bond transcends death itself, allowing the spirit to walk between worlds in whatever shape is necessary to fulfill its sacred duty. As I closed the book, a familiar prickling sensation crawled up my spine. I turned slowly toward the window, and there he was, watching me from the tree line, amber eyes reflecting the dim light from my study. This time I didn't look away, and this time, neither did he. Max had been my lifeline after Jim died. The German shepherd that had brought Jim into my clinic that fateful day now slept at the foot of my half-empty bed, his steady breathing sometimes the only thing anchoring me to reality. He had become attuned to my grief, pressing his warm body against my legs whenever tears threatened to overwhelm me. March arrived with relentless rain, transforming our property into a muddy archipelago of puddles. During a brief evening reprieve from the downpour, I had led Max out for his usual patrol of the yard, while I sorted through bills at the kitchen table. Thunder cracked overhead without warning. I glanced up, expecting to see Max scratching at the door. He'd always been terrified of storms. But the porch was empty. "Max," I called, stepping out onto the wet porch. Nothing but the accelerating patter of rain answered me. I grabbed a flashlight and a raincoat, panic rising in my throat as I called his name into the gathering darkness. For hours I searched, sloshing through mud, checking every outbuilding, following the perimeter of our property where it met the woods. By midnight, drenched and hoarse from calling, I collapsed onto the porch steps. Losing Max felt like losing the last living connection to Jim. A final cruel twist of fate's knife. For 2 days I posted flyers, called shelters, and wandered our woods until my boots wore blisters into my heels. Each night, I returned home to a house that felt emptier than ever. On the third night, broken with exhaustion, I finally succumbed to sleep on the couch, still dressed in mud-spattered jeans. The front door cracked open despite the chill. A soft whine pierced my dreamless sleep. Then scratching, insistent, familiar. I bolted upright, momentarily disoriented. The living room clock read 3:17 a.m. Another whine. It sounded like Max. I flung the door open to find my dog sitting calmly on the porch, his fur damp, but remarkably clean given his days-long absence. No visible injuries. Not even the expected exhaustion. Just an alertness to his posture that seemed almost proud. "Max, where have you been?" I dropped to my knees, burying my face in his fur as relieved tears spilled down my cheeks. That is when I saw it. Movement at the edge of our yard, where the security light's reach faded. The Dogman stood partially obscured by an ancient oak, his massive frame unmistakable, even in the dim light. Max turned toward him, ears perked forward, not in alarm, but in recognition. The creature lifted a clawed hand in what could only be described as a gesture of farewell, then melted back into the darkness. Max trotted into the house with the relaxed confidence of a dog who'd never been lost at all, carrying something in his mouth. He dropped it at my feet. Jim's missing dog tags. The metal somehow warm despite the cold night. The chain carefully knotted to shorten its length, as if it had been worn by a neck much larger than a human's. The boundaries between impossible and real blurred like watercolors on wet paper after Max's return. Something fundamental had shifted inside me. Grief giving way to a strange tentative wonder. That night I placed a bowl of leftover beef stew on the edge of the porch before going to bed. By morning it was empty, the bowl carefully placed upright, not a drop spilled. It became a ritual. Food left out at dusk, empty dishes by dawn. Sometimes venison, jerky, or grilled chicken. I remember Jim's carnivorous appetite with a smile as I prepared these offerings. Gradually I moved the bowls closer to the house. He moved with them, a dance of cautious trust between our worlds. On the anniversary of Jim's death, I sat on the porch swing in the gentle April twilight, a plate of Jim's favorite meatloaf beside me. "I know it's you," I said softly to the gathering shadows. "I don't understand how, but I know." The Dogman emerged from the tree line with none of its usual stealth, a deliberate appearance, his massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. For the first time, he approached in full light, each careful step seeming to ask permission. Up close, the mingling of wolf and man was even more extraordinary. Powerful muscles moved beneath dark fur, clawed hands capable of both terrible violence and surprising gentleness. His face was neither fully human nor animal, but something transcendent. Jim's expressive eyes, gazing from a face reshaped by forces beyond comprehension. "How is this possible?" I whispered, tears spilling unchecked. He couldn't answer, of course. Instead, he slowly knelt before me, bringing those familiar eyes level with mine. A rumbling sound vibrated from his chest. Not a growl, but something softer, almost like the way Jim used to hum when words failed him. With trembling fingers, I reached out. He remained perfectly still as I touched the coarse fur of his cheek. Beneath my palm, I felt the familiar contour of Jim's jawline, impossibly preserved within this wild form. "He kept your promise," I said through tears. His massive head bowed in acknowledgement. 2 weeks later, my friend Bill from town council pounded on my door, red-faced and clutching his hunting rifle. "There's something in these woods, Eleanor. Something dangerous. A pack of us are going hunting tomorrow night." The old Eleanor might have nodded quickly, meekly. The woman I'd become, though, stood straight-backed in the doorway. "There's nothing dangerous on my property, Bill. And if I catch anyone trespassing with weapons, I'll have them arrested." That night, as moonlight silvered the meadow grass, I walked barefoot to the edge of the woods. "They're looking for you," I said to the darkness. "You need to be careful." He emerged like a shadow-given form, head tilted in that questioning way I'd come to cherish. "This is your home, too," I told him. "We'll protect it together. Life reshapes itself around new truths if you let it." The boundaries of my existence, once narrowed by grief, expanded to include midnight walks with a guardian that defied explanation, bowls shared under stars, and a love that had found its way back against impossible odds. Some nights I still catch myself staring at wedding photos, tracing Jim's smile with my fingertip. But now I also step onto the porch and whisper stories into the watchful darkness, knowing that he hears every word. I know that neighbors whisper about the strange widow on the old farm who talks to shadows and leaves food in the woods. Let them. They see only what their minds allow. I've learned that love, like most powerful forces of nature, cannot be contained by the limits of human understanding. It adapts. It evolves. It finds new forms. And sometimes, it watches over you with amber eyes from the edge of what's possible.
We're on the air like nothing is wrong, cause tonight's show is sponsored by a guy named Sean. Please join me in thanking channel member Sean Saunders for making this episode possible. As a channel member, he gets to see our weekly secret uncensored episodes, like the new one coming out later tonight called Dogman Broke Into My Summer Home.
The telepathic Dogman. Dear Scary Stories, it's there again tonight. Standing at the edge of where my yard meets the tree line, half hidden in shadow but unmistakable. 7 feet tall at least, with shoulders broad enough to fill a door frame. The moonlight catches its amber eyes, giving them an eerie glow that seems to pulse with intelligence. I'm frozen on my back porch, one hand still on the screen door handle, the other clutching my flashlight like it might somehow protect me. The beam trembles across the grass but falls short of reaching the creature. Maybe that's for the best. There are things you can't unsee. Its head tilts slightly, nostrils flaring as it scents the air. The snout is too long to be a bear, the posture too upright to be a wolf. A low growl vibrates through the night. Not aggressive exactly, but questioning. My chest tightens as if invisible bands are constricting around my lungs. And then it happens again. The voice. Not in my ears, but somehow inside my skull. Bypassing my senses and appearing fully formed in my consciousness. Don't go inside. Stay out and meet me. The words aren't spoken so much as felt, like thoughts that aren't my own taking root in my mind. My heart hammers wildly against my ribs, and sweat breaks out across my forehead. In spite of the winter chill, it tells me it won't harm me. It tells me to walk out to the trees. Instead, I stumble backward into my kitchen, slamming the door and twisting the deadbolt with shaking fingers. My curtains are still open, and I can still see it, outside, watching me, those intelligent eyes following my panicked movements. Its massive head turns slightly, perhaps registering my fear. It's wondering why I'm hiding. The voice in my head carries a note of genuine confusion. For one insane moment, I almost feel guilty for my terror, before common sense crashes back. That thing could tear me apart in seconds. I've seen the carcasses of deer in these woods, and I wondered what had killed them. I forced myself to move deeper into the house, away from the windows, away from the doors. In the hallway, I slide down against the wall, my legs finally giving out. I can hear it inside my head, a little quieter now at distance, but still there. It has questions for me. It has many questions. My hands cover my ears, but it's useless. How do you block out a voice that's coming from inside your own skull? It's letting me know it will return, each night, until I come outside. Through the window at the end of the hall, I can see its silhouette, melting back into the darkness of the forest. Only when it's completely gone does my breathing begin to normalize, although my shirt is soaked with cold sweat. This is the third time this week, and I don't think it's going away. 6 months ago, I thought this place was paradise. 3 acres of mixed woodland and meadow, a renovated farmhouse with good bones and a wraparound porch. No neighbors for half a mile in any direction. Just me, the whispering pines, and a sky so full of stars at night that it made my chest ache with wonder. You'll go stir-crazy out there all alone, my mother had warned me when I bought the place. She said humans aren't meant to be solitary creatures. But solitude was exactly what I craved after 15 years in Chicago, where privacy was as rare as silence. Out here, though, out here I could think for myself. Out here I could hear myself think. I established simple routines. Morning coffee on the east porch watching the sun climb over the ridge. Afternoons spent writing, or tending my fledgling vegetable garden. Evenings with books by the wood stove. The first strange footprints appeared in April after the spring thaw. Too large for a coyote, too elongated for a bear. I dismissed them as some oddity of melting snow. But then came the howls, not the familiar yips of coyotes, but something deeper, more resonant, something that seemed to echo from inside my own chest, even as it reverberated through the trees. I began feeling watched sometime in May. Just a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It would come and go, strongest at dusk. By June, I was keeping my shotgun loaded. I remember the exact moment that everything changed. It was a Tuesday evening in late September, the kind where summer's warmth lingers just enough to let you work outside after dinner. I was splitting firewood near the edge of my property, the rhythmic thwack of the axe almost meditative, as twilight settled around me. That's when I felt it, that distinct sensation of being watched. Not the vague uneasiness I'd grown accustomed to, but something immediate and intense. The hair on my arms stood up before my conscious mind registered why. I paused mid-swing, my breath clouding in the cooling air. The forest had gone silent. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just a heavy stillness that pressed against my eardrums. Slowly I lowered the axe, and I turned toward the tree line. There it was, standing between two ancient oaks, partially obscured but unmistakably there, a figure too tall and too broad to be human. My mind scrambled for explanations. A bear standing on its hind legs, a trick of fading light, a hunter in some kind of a ghillie suit, but nothing fit with what my eyes were seeing. Its shoulders hunched forward slightly, powerful and covered in dark fur that ruffled in the evening breeze. The head was what shattered any rational explanation. Elongated like a wolf's, but massive, with ears that stood alert and swiveled slightly as it watched me. Even from 50 yards away, I could see its eyes reflecting the last light of day with an unnatural amber glow. My body understood the danger before my mind could process it. The axe slipped from my suddenly numb fingers. My heart slammed against my ribs as adrenaline flooded my system. Every instinct screamed that I was being hunted by a predator. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. It made no move toward me, and I couldn't have moved if I wanted to. Then, it tilted its head slightly, almost curiously, and I swear I saw intelligence in those eyes. Not just animal awareness, but something deeper and more deliberate. That's when my paralysis broke. I backed away, slowly at first. Then I turned and ran for the house, abandoning the axe, expecting at any moment to hear heavy footfalls behind me. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. Through the window I could still see it standing there at the forest's edge, watching my house with unnerving patience. As darkness fell completely, it finally turned and melted back into the trees, moving with a kind of a grace that belied its size. That night, I pulled my grandfather's hunting rifle from the closet, I loaded it, and I kept it beside my bed. I lied to myself that I'd imagined the intelligence in those eyes, that it was just an unusually large wolf or some unknown predator. But deep down I knew better. Whatever I had seen wasn't just a wild animal, and somehow that made it infinitely more terrifying. 3 nights after that sighting, I jolted awake at 3:17 a.m. The digital clock's red numbers burned in the darkness as I tried to figure out what had awakened me. The house was silent, except for the usual creaks of the old structure settling. Outside, the moon cast silver light across my yard, revealing nothing unusual. I was about to lie back down when I felt it, a strange pressure inside my skull, like the buildup before a migraine but without pain. Then I could feel that voice inside telling me that it knew I was awake. The voice wasn't audible, not something my ears detected. It formed directly in my mind, bypassing my senses entirely, clear and distinct from my own thoughts, with an alien quality I can't properly describe, like listening to a foreign language that you somehow understand. I sat bolt upright, heart racing, eyes darting around the empty room. It told me not to be afraid. It told me that it wanted to know me. "Who's there?" I whispered, feeling ridiculous talking to an empty room. It told me to come outside. It told me it was waiting. Somehow the creature I'd seen was communicating with me. The impossibility of this made my head swim. Telepathy couldn't be real. It just couldn't be. Yet the voice continued, patient, persistent. It told me that it saw me and I saw it. Now it wanted to meet properly. I pulled the blankets up like a child hiding from monsters, as if cotton could shield me from a voice inside my own head. "Go away," I said. "Leave me alone." A sensation like curious puzzlement filtered through my consciousness. Not my emotion. Its emotion. Wondering why did I fear? Logic battled terror as I processed this. It was right that it had made no aggressive move toward me, but everything I knew about predators and survival screamed that this thing was dangerous. Its human-like intelligence made it more threatening, not less. It told me, "Tomorrow night, come to the edge of your territory and it will wait for me." The pressure in my head subsided gradually, leaving me shaking and drenched in sweat. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat up with the rifle across my lap until dawn painted the room in light. The next night it happened again, and the next. Each time the voice seemed to linger longer, becoming more insistent, asking me to step outside, to meet at the forest's edge. Each time I refused, huddled in my house with doors locked and weapons close at hand. My sleep deteriorated to brief, fitful naps. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and simple tasks became challenging as exhaustion took its toll. I started leaving lights on throughout the night, though something told me darkness made no difference to this creature. What terrified me most wasn't the creature's existence, although that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was the growing familiarity of the voice, how quickly I was becoming accustomed to this impossible intrusion, how some small, curious part of me wondered what would happen if I did go outside. During daylight hours, I could almost convince myself it was all an elaborate hallucination brought on by isolation. Beneath sunset brought fresh dread, knowing night would bring the voice slipping once again into my mind. Patient, persistent, telling me to go outside. The turning point came on the 14th night. I had managed perhaps 2 hours of actual sleep when the sensation jolted me awake. That familiar pressure building inside my skull, but stronger now, more insistent. It was telling me it was growing impatient with the barrier between us. The voice had changed, less questioning, more commanding. I sat up squinting at the red numbers on my clock. 2:48 a.m. "Leave me alone," I whispered. "Please, just go away." It told me I was a puzzle it needed to solve. Then the questions came rapid fire, hammering into my consciousness. Each one pushed against my mental defenses with increasing pressure, until it felt like my skull might crack. It was telling me to come outside. The command hit with such force that I gasped, doubling over. For a terrifying moment, my body actually moved to comply, legs swinging over the side of the bed, standing up before I could stop myself. I grabbed the bedpost, fighting against the compulsion with everything I had. "No," I shouted to the empty room, "stay out of my head." Something like surprise rippled through our connection, and the pressure eased slightly. I collapsed back onto the bed, trembling and drenched with sweat. It told me that others of my kind had also fought at first before they understood. Others. So there had been others who experienced this. That thought both terrified and somehow comforted me. I wasn't the first. But what had happened to them? It told me that tomorrow night would be the final request. It told me I should come willingly, or it would pull me out. The presence withdrew abruptly, leaving me gasping like someone who'd nearly drowned. Dawn was still hours away, but I knew sleep wouldn't return. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and I stared at my haggard reflection. Something had to change. I couldn't continue like this, sleep-deprived and terrorized. The creature was escalating. I had the sickening feeling it could make good on its threat, to pull me out, whatever exactly it meant by that. I wasn't ready for this. No one could be ready for this, but as the familiar pressure began building in my skull, I knew tonight would end differently than all the nights before, because I knew it was time to choose. In the end, I ran, grabbed my keys at 3 a.m., threw clothes in a duffel bag, and bolted for my car while the voice hammered against my consciousness. It was asking me where I was going. It was telling me to stop. The mental pressure was excruciating as I fumbled with the ignition, my vision blurring with tears of pain. Through the windshield, I caught a glimpse of movement, the massive silhouette loping from the tree line toward my car. I floored it, tires spraying gravel. In the rearview mirror, amber eyes reflected the headlights, growing smaller as distance stretched between us. With each mile, the voice faded, first to a whisper, then to blessed silence. I drove until dawn painted the sky pink, finally collapsing in a motel room 3 states away. That was a year ago this week. Sometimes in dreams I feel a familiar pressure building behind my eyes. Sometimes I imagine curious questions floating at the edge of my consciousness. But they never fully form. They never breach the sanctity of my waking mind. I won't go back. I can't go back. But sometimes in quieter moments, I wonder what it wanted to know about me, and whether someday someone else will ever answer its call.
It's a classic pullover, play with the scary stories, got it. It's a classic pullover, money and a stand-up to go. Available in white, black, navy, gray, or pink. Link is in the description.
Although we're a Dogman channel and not one about Bigfoot, tonight's show is brought to you by Long Island Bigfoot. Please join me in thanking channel member Long Island Bigfoot for making this episode possible. As a channel member, he gets to see our weekly secret uncensored episodes. He's also got an amazing channel about not only Bigfoot, but Dogman as well, including sightings of his own that he's been featured on Vic Cundiff's show talking about.
Dogman Guardian of the Woods. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I remember it like it happened just yesterday. The screaming came first, a sound no human throat could make, something between a roar and a shriek that shattered the evening calm and sent birds exploding from the tree line. I froze on my porch, coffee mug suspended halfway to my lips, as the forest seemed to hold its breath along with me. And then I saw them. 2 massive figures crashed through the underbrush at the edge of my clearing, locked in combat that bent saplings and sent decades-old fallen logs splintering beneath their weight. My guardian, my impossible, inexplicable protector, reared to his full 7-foot height, his canine muzzle pulled back in a snarl that exposed teeth designed for tearing. His dark fur bristled along his spine, and those intelligent eyes, too knowing to belong to any animal, flashed with calculated fury. But what he fought, it was a Sasquatch. It must have been a Sasquatch, and it moved with terrifying speed for something so massive. Where my Dogman's movements were controlled and purposeful, this creature was pure chaos, a blur of matted reddish-brown fur and impossibly long limbs. It howled again, a sound that vibrated in my chest cavity and liquefied my knees. I caught glimpses of its face as they struggled, flatter than my guardian's and yet not human, with deep-set eyes burning with hatred beneath a heavy brow ridge. Coffee splashed across my bare feet as the mug slipped from my fingers. Neither creature noticed. They were locked in some primal dance, the Sasquatch's massive hands trying to grapple, while my Dogman guardian slashed with claws that could have disemboweled a bear. The smell reached me then. Wet fur, and something musky and wild that triggered some ancient part of my brain, screaming, "Run! Hide, you don't belong here." But I couldn't move. This was my home, and he, the impossible creature who had become my silent sentinel, was fighting for it, and for me. "Please," I whispered, the word carried away by the evening breeze. Please don't get hurt. The Sasquatch landed a blow that sent my guardian crashing backward into a stand of young birch trees. Those trees bent and snapped under his weight, and for one terrible moment he lay still. The Sasquatch reared up, beating its chest in a display that sent tremors through the clearing. Then my guardian's eyes met mine across the distance. Something passed between us, the same silent understanding that had formed our strange alliance. He rose, shaking splinters from his fur, and I swear I saw something almost like a smile across that inhuman face before he launched himself back into the fight with renewed purpose. I had no way to help, no weapon that could matter against creatures of myth made flesh. All I could do was bear witness as my protector fought to defend the territory he had claimed. The territory that, for reasons I still couldn't understand, included me. I moved here to these woods toward the beginning of the pandemic, when my office went to remote working from home. I had no relationships tying me to that city, and no desire to move home either. I wanted to be alone, which a lot of us wanted during that paranoid time, but I think for me, it was a more serious desire than for most of the others. For me, it was more permanent. I don't talk about this much because it sounds so antisocial, but I knew that I had missed out on my one chance to get married and have a family, and that I didn't have it in me to try again. I don't mean to imply that I felt sorry for myself. It was more like for some reason, I just decided I would be happier out in the woods and not having very many close friends. Maybe I'm a narcissist, but I don't feel like a narcissist. At any rate, as the pandemic started to run out of gas, I rearranged things with my bosses so that I could keep this house I'd been renting and continue to work here remotely from the forest. The day my employers agreed to this was one of the happiest days I've ever experienced. Other people feel joy when they become engaged or when they give birth. Me? My finest hour was the time I found out I was going to be able to live alone in the woods. Well, not entirely alone. I was going to be able to live with my protector, the Dogman. As I was moving in, people who lived nearby dropped over to warn me to stay out of the woods behind the house. When I asked them why, they shuddered and said that there were things back there which were never meant to exist. Like what, a meth lab? Anyway, I took a walk in those woods to see what strangeness I could see. Rather than feeling stressed or frightened, though, I discovered I felt a sense of protection around me. I was not scared in the least. I felt like I was finally in my true home. My first real encounter with him happened during a late October hike. The autumn air had that particular crispness that makes you feel more alive somehow. The scent of decaying leaves rich in my nostrils. I had ventured deeper into the forbidden woods than usual, following a deer path that wound between ancient oaks and maples ablaze with color. The storm rolled in without warning. 1 minute sunlight was filtering through the canopy. The next, darkness descended as if someone had thrown a switch. The wind picked up, bending treetops and sending leaves swirling in miniature tornadoes around my boots. I turned to head back, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The path had vanished, swallowed by shadows and my own disorientation. Fat raindrops began to pelt through the leaves as thunder cracked overhead. My heart raced as I realized I was genuinely lost, my phone showing no service bars. The temperature plummeted, and my light jacket offered little protection against the sudden chill. That's when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. Most people describe this feeling as uncomfortable and threatening, but what flooded through me was different. A strange calm, like slipping into a warm bath after being caught in a blizzard. I stood perfectly still, rain soaking through my clothes, and I slowly turned toward that sensation. There, between two massive hemlocks, stood a figure that shouldn't exist. He, and somehow I instantly knew it was male, stood at least 7 feet tall. his broad shoulders tapering to a narrower waist. But it was his head that made my breath catch. Not human and not wolf, but something in between. A muzzle filled with teeth that could tear flesh from bone, ears that swiveled toward me, and eyes, amber gold and intelligent, watching me with an awareness that was undeniably sentient. We stared at each other through sheets of rain. I should have screamed. I should have run. Instead, I whispered hello. His ears flicked forward. One massive paw hand gestured to the left. Then he turned and began walking slowly in that direction. After a few steps, he looked back at me, waiting. He was showing me the way home. I followed him through the downpour, keeping a distance that seemed to satisfy us both. He moved with impossible silence for something so large, occasionally pausing to ensure I was still behind him. Eventually the trees thinned, and I recognized the clearing behind my house. At the edge of the woods, he stopped. I stepped past him into my yard, then turned to thank him, but he was already melting back between the trees, just a shadow that shouldn't exist, leaving me to question my sanity, even as I knew deep in my bones that I had just met my guardian. After that stormy encounter, something shifted between us, this impossible creature and me. I began leaving offerings at the edge of my yard where the forest begins. A deer roast purchased from the local butcher, a whole raw chicken, once even a pint of blueberries arranged carefully on a flat stone. Each morning I'd find the plate clean, sometimes with a token left in exchange, an unusually shaped stone, a perfect hawk feather, once a wild turkey egg that I scrambled with reverence. We developed a rhythm, my guardian and I. At dusk I'd sit on my back porch with tea or wine, and gradually he grew bold enough to emerge from the tree line. He'd settle at the edge of the forest, massive forms somehow blending with the shadows despite his size. I'd talk to him softly about my day, about my work, sometimes reading aloud from whatever book had captured my interest. He never approached closer than 30 feet, and I never invited him to either. We both understood boundaries. The locals began to notice changes in me. "You seem comfortable out here," Marge from the general store commented one day as she rang up my groceries. "Most city folk get that haunted look around month 3 when the isolation starts eating at them." I just smiled. I guess I'm not most city folk, I told her. She studied me, head tilted. "You seen anything strange out your way? Over near the creek?" "Strange how?" I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as I could. "Just strange. Things that watch you from the trees. Don't go out at night, that's all I'm saying." She handed me my change, eyes serious. "Those woods ain't natural after dark." I nodded politely, but inside I was laughing. If she only knew what haunted those woods was now my most consistent relationship. By spring I'd started venturing deeper into the forest, no longer fearing getting lost. He was always there, sometimes visible, more often just a presence felt rather than seen. I mapped his territory in my mind. The ridge to the north seemed to be his preferred hunting ground. The small waterfall and pool to the east where I once glimpsed him drinking. One twilight I was sitting on my usual porch chair when he emerged from the trees, moving with deliberate purpose. He approached closer than ever before, stopping just 15 feet away. In his hand paw was a small object that he placed carefully on the ground before backing away. Heart pounding, I waited until he retreated to retrieve it. A simple leather bracelet, clearly man-made, weathered but intact. I slipped it over my wrist, understanding the significance though not the origin. Something given, something received, a covenant between us. That night I slept with my windows open for the first time, unafraid despite the chorus of night sounds. My protector was out there, and for reasons I couldn't articulate, I trusted him completely. The first signs were subtle. My guardian's behavior shifted sometime in late summer, more vigilant, appearing more frequently and staying longer each time. He began marking territory in ways I recognized from my research into wolves. Claw marks 6 feet up on trees surrounding my property. Strategic placement of broken branches. I might have dismissed it as seasonal behavior, if not for the changes in the forest itself. The usual chatter of birds would sometimes stop abruptly, the silence spreading like spilled ink. The deer that occasionally grazed on my yard's edge disappeared entirely. Even the air felt heavier, expectant. And then came the reports from town. My friend Sheila's goats got slaughtered, found with their necks broken rather than torn open. An overnight camper's tent shredded, though thankfully they'd been staying in their RV that night. My friend Frank's hunting cameras capturing something on the ridge that moved too fast to be identified, but left 18-inch footprints that weren't dog or bear. "It's moving through," old Pete said cryptically when a group gathered at the general store to discuss the incidents. His roomy eyes found mine across the room, passing through looking for something or looking for someone. The group's worried murmurs washed over me as ice formed in my stomach. I knew somehow what was happening. Something had invaded my guardian's territory, our territory, and the careful balance was tilting toward confrontation. That night I heard it for the first time, a call unlike any animal I recognized. Not a howl or a roar, but something primal that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my brain. It came from the ridge beyond my property, miles away, but carrying clearly in the still night air. My guardian appeared at the forest edge moments later, agitated in a way I'd never seen before. He paced, his massive form tense, eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond. When that cry came again, he answered, a sound that raised every hair on my body and reminded me that despite our bond, he was still something wild and ancient and powerful. I called out asking, "What's coming?" He turned those amber eyes to me, and for the first time approached my porch without hesitation. Standing at the bottom step, his massive height brought his face level with mine. Up close, the details I'd never seen clearly emerged. The silver strands mixed with the dark fur, the small notch missing from one ear, the intelligence and concern in those eyes. He raised a clawed hand toward the distant ridge, then made a sweeping motion toward my house, his meaning clear even without the words. "It's coming here." For the next 3 nights I barely slept. The distant calls continued, moving gradually closer. My guardian remained nearby, sometimes disappearing for hours only to return with fresh marks of conflict. A gash across his shoulder one time. We were building towards something inevitable. The question wasn't if. The question was when. The when was at dusk, that in-between time when the world holds its breath. I was standing on my porch watching the sun bleed gold and crimson through the trees, when the forest went silent. Not gradually as day creatures bedded down and night creatures woke, but all at once. A vacuum of sound that made my ears ring. My coffee mug froze halfway to my lips. The screaming came first, a sound no human throat could make, something between a roar and a shriek that shattered the evening calm and sent birds exploding from the tree line. I stood frozen, heart hammering against my ribs, and then I saw them. 2 massive figures crashed through the underbrush at the edge of my clearing, locked in combat that bent saplings and sent decades-old fallen logs splintering beneath their weight. My guardian, my protector, reared to his full height, and then the Sasquatch moved with terrifying speed. My guardian fought with the strategy of a seasoned warrior. He would dart in, raking claws across the Sasquatch's flank, then dance away before those massive arms could grab him. But that squatch was preternaturally strong, each blow landing with force that would shatter bone in a normal creature. The tide turned when the Sasquatch did something that surprised both of us. He charged directly toward my house. Toward me. Something shifted in my guardian's demeanor, a new ferocity igniting in those amber eyes. This wasn't just about territory anymore. Now it was about me. In that moment I found my voice and my courage. I grabbed the iron poker from beside my fireplace and I stood my ground at the porch steps. "This is my home," I shouted, brandishing the makeshift weapon. The Sasquatch hesitated for just one heartbeat, but that was enough. My guardian launched himself onto the creature's back, jaws closing around the base of its skull. The Sasquatch roared in pain and rage, reaching back to dislodge him, but my guardian held fast, his own massive weight dragging the creature backward. They tumbled in a tornado of fur and limbs, ripping up earth and vegetation. The Sasquatch finally broke free, but something had changed. Now I could see fear in his eyes. My guardian positioned himself squarely between the creature and my house. His message clear: she is under my protection. With one final hate-filled shriek, the Sasquatch retreated, crashing through the underbrush. My guardian gave chase, the sounds of their passage fading as they disappeared deeper into the forest. I stood trembling on my porch, the poker still clutched in my white-knuckled hands, wondering if he would return, or if the price of my protection had been my protector's life. Well, he did come back, but it was 3 hours later. I had been sitting vigil on the porch, a first aid kit open beside me, a spotlight trained on the forest edge. When he emerged from the trees, limping but upright, relief flooded through me with such intensity that tears sprang to my eyes. His fur was messy. A deep gash ran from his left shoulder down his chest, and he held one arm slightly bent, favoring it. But his eyes, when they met mine, displayed victory. I stepped off the porch, our unspoken boundary dissolving in this moment of need. "Let me help you," I said softly, approaching slowly with clean towels and water. To my amazement, he sank to his knees, bringing himself to my height. Trust for trust, protection for protection. I cleaned his wounds as best I could, my hands trembling against his fur, which was softer than I had imagined. He remained perfectly still, only his breathing and occasional subtle flinch betraying his pain. When I finished, he gently took my hand in his enormous paw-like one, careful to keep his claws retracted like a cat. He pressed my palm against his chest over his heart. The gesture needed no translation. I know. I don't understand why, but I told him I know. That night he slept at the forest edge within sight of my bedroom window. By morning he had vanished into the woods again, but something fundamental had shifted. The Sasquatch never returned, driven from this territory by a force more determined, more invested in its protection than mere animal instinct could explain. People ask me sometimes why I stay out here alone. They mean well, these concerned friends and relatives who picture me vulnerable and isolated. They don't understand that I've never felt more connected, more protected than I do in these woods that others fear. I've stopped trying to explain. How do you tell someone that your closest relationship is with a 7-foot dogman who guards your property for reasons neither of us fully comprehend? That in finding this impossible guardian, I found something I never knew I was missing. Acceptance without explanation. Protection without debt. Connection without demand. Some nights when the moon is full, I leave my bedroom window open and I hear him moving through the forest. My guardian. My impossible friend. And I know with bone-deep certainty that in this wild place where humans fear to tread alone, I have found my true home and my true belonging. Not despite the strangeness, but because of it. Sometimes the most profound connections come in forms we could never anticipate. And sometimes protection comes from the very things that others warn us against. He's like a badass superhero movie, not a stupid lame one like Morbius. He's our newest channel member, and he's asked for us to call him Scorpius. Please join me in thanking our newest channel member, Scorpius, for making this episode possible. Scorpius joined on the PayPal side through peterbernard.com. YouTube doesn't like me to say this, but that's actually better for me. Rather than having to wait a month and a half to get paid, I get it the same day. But whatever's most convenient for you is great. As a channel member, Scorpius gets to see our weekly secret uncensored episodes, like the new one we put out last night called Dogman Broke Into My Summer Home. For more information about how you can help this channel stay online like the wonderful Scorpius, here's our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank?
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button. Or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.